Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and I am here for my first regional qualifier video here. This time, it is going to be in the LCK. We're going to be going over both of the first round LCK regional qualifier matchups. That means by the end of this video, we will know who is the number 3 seed going to Worlds and who is the first of the 4 teams to officially be eliminated from Worlds contention, while the final 2 will duke it out a little bit later this week for that 4 seed at Worlds. So pretty exciting episode, a lot of good action, definitely some interesting matchups that I was really excited to see how they would play out, because there's so many different scenarios that I think you could expect from these 4 teams. And so if you were excited as well, let me know down in the comment section below. What did you think of these 2 series? Did they go as you expected? Did they go a little bit differently than maybe you anticipated? What was your expectation for these series? Let me know all of that down in the comment section below. But let's go ahead and jump right into our first series here of the LCK Worlds Regional Qualifier. And we kick it off with our 3-4 matchup here between the 3-seeded Liiv SANDBOX team and the 4-seeded DAMWON Kia. Definitely an intriguing matchup that I think is relatively evenly matched. I think obviously DAMWON wants to find themselves a little bit higher up in the bracket than maybe they have found themselves for a majority of the year. A team that has been in back-to-back World Finals, really wants to get back to the World Championship and not have to go through maybe a play-in stage or something like that. Liiv SANDBOX, on the other end, has really outperformed the expectations that they have had pretty much all year long. Being the number 3 seed at Regional Qualifier is pretty amazing, quite frankly, for a team that just didn't have that kind of upside. So, really excited to see how this series plays out. Obviously, a lot of really interesting matchups, but my matchup of the series was Dectum and Prince in the bottom lane. However that matchup went probably was going to determine the series, although Canyon Croco certainly gives them a run for their money. So a lot of really interesting things to talk about here in the matchup. So without previewing it too much, I already did that in the end of my LCK Finals video. Let's go ahead and jump right into game number 1. And game number 1 was a DAMWON win. DAMWON does pick up the game number 1 victory, which is huge for them. This is a big win, really setting the pace and the tone of the series here. They honestly were just significantly better. This was a complete outclassing by DAMWON, and it was a really impressive performance. This is the kind of team that you wanted to see show up here at the Regional Gauntlet. Obviously, they had their struggles a little bit in the regular season, but this was a team that clearly, teams still feared a little bit. Liiv SANDBOX being chosen to be played by Gen.G, I should say, over DAMWON in the playoffs, kind of an indicator of that. DAMWON comes out here in game 1 and looks really solid. They played around bot lane, which is something that they've been doing a little bit more and more. I think Showmaker originally was a big piece of what they wanted to do in the beginning part of the season, but they realized, I think midway through, that that's just not the meta anymore. And so Canyon really started investing into Dectum and Kellen and really started trying to get them ahead. And I thought they were, in my opinion, I talk about this on the LCK reviews a lot, underrated as a duo pretty much the whole year. I thought they were pretty good, like a top 4-ish duo in the LCK. Obviously, you're going up against Prince and Gale, who were probably number 2 this year in terms of duos in the LCK. But still, Dectum and Kellen weren't pushovers. Canyon does a really good job of getting a lead here on the Sejuani into a matchup that isn't the most clean in the Vi, and he's able to translate that into the Lucian Nami, making sure that the Lucian gets ahead. And Dectum takes it and runs with it. Does a really good job of capitalizing on all the resources that he's given. Canyon does a really great job, but Dectum is going to get the player of the game. Like I said, Canyon did do a really good job to set up Dectum, but Dectum still had to be the one to carry this game here. And quite frankly, especially towards the mid game, you start to get that Lucian Aphelios matchup where Aphelios starts to get online, even if Lucian has gold. You're definitely starting to get a lot shorter range. You can be hit by Ahri charms. You can get Vi ulted. There are a lot of different things. Even the Gragas ult can come out. There are a lot of different things that can cause Lucian to be put in a really bad spot if he doesn't play incredibly carefully. Dectum, however, just outplayed all of that. Really was never in a position where he had to be all that scared. Had a really good front line here of the Sejuani. Eventually, the Aatrox would come down as well. And then Showmaker got to that point in the mid to late game where he was just unkillable on the swing because he was so much stronger than the Ahri. Nami did a great job of making sure that Lucian had the extra damage, as well as any healing that he needed to do, and he was able to carry a lot of these fights when it came to damage. So Dectum is going to get my player of the game in game number 1 on this Lucian. Very good game from him. A good game from Kellen. Still don't love the build. Obviously, I'm not going to sit here and harp on it. I've harped on it enough on this channel, but still don't love the Nami build. But at the end of the day, it's a good win. And then, like I said, Canyon was also really good. You had Nuguri and Showmaker there. They were fine. Not really the most, dominant games from either. Showmaker did a good job to honestly just straight up win his lane, I would say, over Closer, which is impressive, I think, overall. And I think Nuguri in the same way did just beat Dove. It wasn't as dominant in the top lane. You know, Aatrox Gragas is a little bit neutral, but still fine. It's still a good win, I'd say, overall for DAMWON. Pretty much everybody on the team showing up and playing well. As for Liiv, not a great start. This is a team that I think really wanted to get out to a little bit of a momentum start. Krako especially is a very heavy momentum player. He needs to be feeling good for him to play at his best level. We've seen that basically throughout the whole year. This team can go on a few losing streaks. When they lose game one, they can typically, you know, spiral a little bit out of control, but it's one bad game. Krako did play poorly. He's going to get my dud of the game here for SANDBOX. It wasn't the worst game in the world. I'm not going to sit here and be like, you know, I don't see how this team can compete with DAMWON or anything like that. They just got outplayed in the early game and couldn't really respond. Prince has always been the guy for SANDBOX. He's been the one to build everything around. Obviously, kind of appropriate that he's playing for his Worlds slot against DAMWON here, but Prince obviously is the guy that this entire team is built around, and when Dectum gets a pretty huge lead and Prince really isn't able to compound that, this is what I've been talking about with SANDBOX. I very much struggle to see a world in which they win consistently. Obviously, I think they can take games. Players like Krako and Closer can have pop-off games. It's just the consistency with which they can have them. Closer gets one of his best picks in the meta and just straight loses in the mid lane to Showmaker on the Swain, which is a winning matchup for Closer. So overall, I just don't think, you know, not a good game from him. And then Prince and Kale just got outscaled. It really wasn't entirely their fault. Kale didn't play very good this game. He was outpositioned quite frequently on the Lulu, trying to play that more frontline role to give Prince as many opportunities as he could. I understand the idea behind it, but it didn't quite work out. And then, like I said, Dove also got outplayed in the top lane. But overall, just not a great game from Liiv SANDBOX. Really not a ton to talk about here. A bit of a top gap for Nuguri. I should say DAMWON had some pretty beautiful objective setups, whether it was around Dragon or around Baron. They danced a lot this game, but they really put themselves in good spots to basically force SANDBOX to come into them and try to fight. And, I mean, look at this DAMWON team. You're not going to win a 5v5 team fight if they're ahead. So, really, really good game from them. And unfortunately, Krako and Closer just weren't up to the task of being able to match Canyon and Showmaker in terms of the macro play, and Dectum got online and was just able to carry. So, overall, a good win for DAMWON here in game number 1. Certainly not the end of the series by any means. We've seen plenty of teams come back from 0-2, let alone 0-1. Liiv SANDBOX is a good team. Obviously, their strategy is going to be the same every single game. If they can get the ball rolling on Prince in the bottom lane, they're in a good spot to win games. But if they can't do that, if DAMWON can continue to invest into that bottom lane and can continue to invest in Dectum and Kellen, and if Showmaker can just straight up win without resources in the mid lane, DAMWON's going to look pretty good in this series just like they did in game number 1. So, is Liiv going to be able to change some things up, maybe go for something a little bit more early game aggressive, or is DAMWON going to maintain the grip that they have on this series? Well, the winner of game 2 was Liiv SANDBOX. A huge game 2 win for Liiv here as they even up the series at 1-1. Now, they needed this. If they didn't get this, they were in a really, really tricky spot. I often say that it's never over, even down 2-0, even though it's tough. But we've seen plenty of times teams come back from 0-2 in these playoffs in particular. But DAMWON's a little bit of a different beast. They're a team that has been notoriously good at being able to close out series as a team, at least maybe outside of the World Finals last year. So overall, I was definitely getting a little concerned when early game kind of went DAMWON's way here. Canyon and Showmaker really linked up for a pretty strong early game. In this one, Canyon on the Vi really wanted to try and take advantage of the timings, and this is what I agree. This is how you play Vi. I think a lot of people play Vi a little bit too passively because she has that point-and-click ult. She's going to be useful in the late game, but her damage really does fall off, at least a decent amount. I think the early game version of Vi is, quite frankly, the strongest version of Vi, and I really like seeing Vi players really take advantage of that and try to push the tempo. Canyon did that by moving around with Showmaker, making sure that he got a ton of kills on this Vex, and obviously, Vex isn't the most common pick in the meta right now, but I still think Vex is kind of okay, a pretty good pick overall, especially if you're good at Vex and you're able to get the resets and you're able to kind of take over the mid game. That's really where Vex kind of shines, but unfortunately for DAMWON here, while Canyon was able to get Showmaker's lead, he couldn't really keep the lead on himself. He started playing a lot more risky in the mid game and really was getting caught out for it, mostly because Krako was just kind of out-pathing him and was able to catch up in gold towards the mid game, was able to really start stacking a lot of objectives, got a lot of the first few dragons, was able to translate that lead into his mid laner here in Closer, and Closer really got online with the Ahri as well. A really, really good game from the jungle mid duo of Liiv SANDBOX, especially after, I would say, like the 10-minute mark, where those two really started to take over. I gotta point it out, Nuguri was subbed out this game. Obviously, shout out Danny. I don't really know exactly what the thought process behind any of this is. He's been subbing out Nuguri at multiple points throughout the playoffs, and, you know, it is worth noting Nuguri is still undefeated in the playoffs, whether it be against T1 or now against Liiv SANDBOX. He has yet to lose a game, but Bertle comes back in. They put him on the Yone, a much more aggressive pick, and honestly, he really does not take advantage of that. This is a pick that really needs to generate a lead in order to be ridiculously useful, and unfortunately for Bertle, he was not able to generate that lead in this game, so not good for DAMWON there. Definitely something to keep in mind, but Liiv SANDBOX played it well. Like I said, Krako in the mid game did a really good job of being able to take back tempo after what was a decent early game, especially from Showmaker, and it basically got to the point where he was just going to be first to every single objective that they had on the map, and that was a huge positive, I think, for SANDBOX. It allowed Closer, I think, to play significantly more aggressive, even with the Vex there. Obviously, when she didn't have the backup of the Vi or the resets, like, available, Vex doesn't really have that easy of a job just straight up killing Ahri, because Ahri can just ult out of a lot of these fights, and so Closer was really in a good spot to be able to translate to a lot of those objectives first, be able to hit charms in those team fights, and be able to carry a lot of the damage, which, honestly, Ahri doesn't do all that easily, so really good game from Closer. Obviously, Ahri is one of, if not his best pick in this meta right now, so very, very bold by DAMWON to give that over to him twice, but I guess they saw it in game one, and basically thought they didn't need to ban it out. They didn't think they needed to worry about it, but with the Swain gone, with the Lissandra gone, the Ahri picked up, you don't really have that easy counter pick. That's something that can just go even in lane and kind of be more useful late. You have to be able to beat it, and while Showmaker did get ahead, it wasn't really at the expense of Closer in the long run. So Closer and Krako basically played the heroes of this story, which is definitely a different look for SANDBOX, but something that I'm actually incredibly happy to see. Closer really got better, I think, throughout the split. He was really bad in spring, like really, really, really bad in spring. And then in summer, he still had his games where he was not good. I think the meta favored him significantly more. He could go on picks like Ahri, he could go on picks like Akali significantly more often and not be punished nearly as much for it. Obviously, with Dove in the top lane, you have that Akali Yone option if you wanted to go to that, but overall, I think Closer was a little bit better towards the back half of the split, really started to figure things out, and he really showed up in this game, which is definitely good because Prince really didn't carry in the same way that you wanted him to. Obviously, Aphelios Renata into Lucian Nami isn't exactly the laning phase that you're going to be able to snowball out of control, but Krako really isn't playing towards that bottom lane in the way that he was during the regular season. I'm not saying that that's a problem. Honestly, one of my biggest complaints with SANDBOX throughout the year was the fact that it felt like they had to play through bot in order to win games against good teams. This is a really good look to see that they can play through mid lane, they can get Closer on the Ahri, Krako can really just take over the entire map, and they can win the game without Prince being this super big, unbelievable damage threat. He still did a lot of damage in the back half of this game, don't get me wrong. The Aphelios is still going to hurt if he gets to the late game relatively even, but he wasn't the focal point. He wasn't the one that all of the game plan drove through, and I think that's a huge positive for SANDBOX overall. Good win for them. A bad loss for DAMWON. Like I said, they had some tempo in this game, but they couldn't really capitalize on it in any meaningful way at the very least. Canyon, while having a good game, really, like, a good early game, I should say, really, really fumbled the bag in the mid game, like a really, really bad mid game from Canyon, and then just by the end game here, he was, like, griefing the game. You get this sometimes from Canyon. He's gonna get my dud of the game here in the jungle. You sometimes get this. Obviously, Canyon is a very feast or famine player, but DAMWON still plays entirely through him. Whether you like that or not, DAMWON still plays entirely through Canyon, and so when this team is good, like they were in game one, it's often Canyon being able to set up a player like Dectum or Showmaker to be able to win the game. When they lose like this in game number two, it's often Canyon overextending, trying to make too many plays on his own, getting caught out, and giving a lot of gold over to whoever, the enemy jungler, the enemy mid laner in this case, but whoever ends up being the one to punish him for it. So overall, not a great game from Canyon. He did have a good early game, but again, if you grief this hard in the end game, you absolutely deserve the dud of the game. I do got to give a little bit of credit to Showmaker. He did play relatively well here on the Vex, but really not a champion that can 1v5, especially when the rest of your team is, quite frankly, running it down. Dectum wasn't useful at all. Bertle especially wasn't useful at all, and then Canyon was actively griefing the end of the game, so Vex is really not a champion that can stop them from doing that and really just carry the team fights anyways, but still a decent game from Showmaker, definitely a step up from him. And then, you know, Kellen, Voidstaff, Nami, I'm not going to keep talking about it, but why? Why do you build Voidstaff on Nami? There's literally no benefit other than the Q, I guess. Your W bounce doesn't get more damage, your heal doesn't get more damage. What exactly are you building it for? Anyways, it doesn't matter. Not a good game overall from DAMWON. Certainly could have been cleaner, but now you're just looking at a best of 3. This is a very winnable series, in my opinion, for both of these teams. SANDBOX has proven that they can win pretty much any game if Prince gets rolling, so they're basically never out of a series because you just need at this point 2 good Prince games and you're moving on to Worlds. But for DAMWON, Canyon, Showmaker, decked them. They're super talented. They should be able to gain leads against some of these lane opponents. They just have to get back to the mentality and the form that they had in that game number 1 rather than the overextension and the overaggression that they had here in game number 2. So, which team is going to capitalize on the momentum state at the moment? Is Liiv SANDBOX going to be able to move their game 2 win into a game 3 win? Or is DAMWON going to be able to recapture the momentum that they had in game 1? Well, the winner of game number 3 was DAMWON Kia. They do take a pivotal game number 3 here, go up 2-1 in the series here, off of the back of their top 3 really just playing phenomenal here. Nuguri is back in for Bertle. Danny realized his mistake. Bertle came in, just wasn't able to punish Dove in the same way that Nuguri did in game number 1. Nuguri comes back in here and is phenomenal on the Gwen. You got to give a lot of credit to him for completely gapping Dove here in game number 3. You got to give a lot of credit to Showmaker in the mid lane for just being significantly better than what Closer is able to output. Obviously, we'll talk about Closer on the LeBlanc pick that I'm not a fan of in a little bit, but Showmaker really, really gapping Closer in this game. And then you got to talk about the player of the game here, Canyon in the jungle. He gets his signature Lee Sin. I talk about it on this channel a lot. Lee Sin's not really a pick I think is all that good right now, but I've said this multiple times because we've seen it in a couple of different scenarios. If you are this good at Lee Sin, just pick it. It does not matter. We saw it recently with Closer, the other one, in North America, where it's like, it doesn't matter if you're not good at, like, if Lee Sin's not good right now. If you can actively play Lee Sin like an assassin in these late game team fights, actively always get on the target that you need to, and be able to punish the early game super hard to the point where your team just scales out of control, then it doesn't matter if he's not meta, because he's doing his job anyways. So, yeah, shout out to Canyon on the Lee Sin. I also really like this draft because they do draft the Lee Sin, but they don't index entirely into that early game. They don't go for the Lucian Nami in this game, which obviously they had gone to the first couple ones. It was still up in this game, and so they had the option to, but instead they go for the Sivir Zeri handshake, which I think is significantly better for Lee Sin, just in general, because it gives him options. Obviously, you can get on something like a Lulu in the early game, or an Aatrox, or, or a Trundle. Like, there are a lot of options to be able to fight in the early game still, but you're not indexing so hard into that by the time you get to 15 minutes, even if you did have a small lead, you're actually looking at a little bit of a damage disadvantage because your team doesn't scale as hard. You're now just looking at a Lee Sin that is a little bit more of a facilitator for these late game carries that will eventually get online, and Lee Sin can kind of speed up that process. I like this draft choice a lot more, and I thought Canyon played it beautifully. He gapped Krako really hard in this game. Just perfect pathing from Canyon, able to get into the top lane and make Dove pay, able to get into the mid lane and make Closer pay. Honestly, just a really, really good game. He's able to secure pretty much every single objective on the map. Really not a lot of trading going on, not a single tower taken by SANDBOX in this game. Overall, just basically a perfect game from Canyon. He's easily deserving a player of the game. But again, I gotta give a shout out to Nuguri in the top lane, who just abused Dove in this lane. Dove, in the 2 games that he's played in Nuguri, he's been completely gapped in both. Nuguri this time on the Gwen, going into the Aatrox, and overall, I think that's a pretty positive matchup for both. Like, I think both can win it. Gwen, I think, is definitely stronger in the short term, but Aatrox will get to that point in the game where he's going to be, I think, just as useful in a team fight. Overall, though, Nuguri was just the better player, and so he gets the big lead. In the top lane, you have Showmaker in the mid lane on the Sylas. A pretty good matchup into the LeBlanc. In my opinion, LeBlanc doesn't really have a lot of opportunities to do anything to you, although you also don't have a ton of opportunities to do anything into her. At that point, it's really just about farming up, shoving the wave, and being able to rotate to when your jungler needs you. But Showmaker was just better. Like, he was significantly earlier to a lot of the plays being made across the map. It really made taking objectives a lot easier for Canyon, although Canyon did invest a bit into the mid lane as well, while Krako didn't. And also, LeBlanc is just a weak pick right now. LeBlanc is one of those champions that I think generally needs to be able to one-shot or close to one-shot people in order for her to be viable at a high level. And she just doesn't have that kind of combat damage right now, especially from behind. And so you get to this point where Closer, and I say this a lot with LeBlanc, you get to this point in the game where she's honestly just not all that useful. She doesn't really do anything. She doesn't really offer any sort of CC outside of the chain, but she doesn't offer, enough damage to really justify not being a more roaming, supportive mid laner like a Taliyah, like a Sylas, like an Ahri even. And so there's really just not a lot of great options. I really like DAMWON's strategy of banning out both the Akali and the Ahri against SANDBOX because it basically forces closer on the LeBlanc. Those are really the only 3 champions he feels comfortable playing right now, or at least that's what it seems like. Again, obviously we know he's a one-trick assassin player, but it's really just been Akali and Ahri that he's had success on, and so you take those picks away and closer again goes back to kind of being that bad player that he was in spring and summer that I was telling everybody was overhyped, and I think we're getting that part again. Krako also got outplayed, definitely something worth noting there. Canyon just had this game under control, but the dead of the game was pretty easy for me. It's Dove in the top lane on this Aatrox. He had 0 impact on the game overall. Not only was he completely destroyed by Nuguri, not only was Canyon able to get a ton of gold on him, but in the late game when he tried to actively, be an Aatrox, he just died so fast. He wasn't able to drain tank even remotely at all, at any point in this game, and so really just not a good game from Dove. A pretty deserving dud of the game here, and he continues to look bad against some of the better top laners in the league, obviously Birdo notwithstanding. Prince and Kayle were fine. They didn't really do anything. Dektum and Kellen got a huge lead, mostly because the map state was super in DK's favor, but it's not like Prince and Kayle were super at fault for this one. It was mostly the top 3 here that were just outplayed. There really is no other excuse for it. They were just Dove, Krako, and Closer were heavily outplayed by Nuguri, Canyon, and Showmaker in this game. So yeah, game 3 going DK's way. What does that mean for the series overall? Well, DK now has a pretty commanding spot. Obviously, being up 2-1 is good, but like I said before, you can't count out SANDBOX because if you just need Prince to be able to win 2 games, if he just gets in a lead in 2 games, it is severely possible for him to just be able to take over and win the game by himself. We've seen it multiple times throughout the split. DK has done a really good job at making sure that Krako has to be in a position here where he can't just focus on this bottom lane over and over again. Whether or not that is, Canyon's doing, or whether or not that's SANDBOX just not investing in their best player. You can make the argument there. I think it's a little bit of both, but overall, like I said, if SANDBOX does invest into that bottom lane and Prince can get ahead, the series is certainly not over, but for DK, this offers a lot of a buffer for them. Obviously, going into a game number 4 with a game lead, only needing to win 1 more, it means you theoretically could drop game number 4 here. It's not the, end-all, be-all that it is for SANDBOX, and so obviously, a little bit of a differing pressure level for both of these teams going into game number 4, but both want to see it end here. So who was able to take game number 4? Well, the winner of game number 4 was DAMWON Kia. They do take game number 4, and therefore take the number 3 spot at the 2022 World Championships from the LCK. A great game number 4 from them. Really, really dominant. And again, pretty much all of their wins in this series were dominant. Even their loss in game number 2, it was the closest game in the series. They really were just the better team by a significant margin. And I think the best way I can describe that is the top lane matchup in this game alone. You had Nuguri versus Dove. Nuguri staying in for game number 4. No shenanigans with Birtle coming in and losing the game for no reason. Nuguri stays in, and he gets to play Aatrox into the Ornn matchup here and just completely obliterates Dove. I think at one point at 20 minutes into the game, Dove had 100-something CS. He was actually at 4 or 5 CS per minute, because he was just getting so obliterated by what Nuguri was doing in that top lane. It's a pretty easy player of the game choice for me, is all I'm going to say. Nuguri, easy player of the game here in game number 4, the clinching game number 4 for DAMWON, but it obviously wasn't just him. Pretty much everybody on this team played this game well. Canyon had a good early game, and was a little bit over-aggressive towards the mid-game with Showmaker. Got caught out a couple times here by the Ahri and the Sivir, but at the end of the day, it didn't really matter. They were always in a good spot, and Dektum and Kellen were often able to trade back in situations like that, but Canyon and Showmaker were good in this game, and they were really good in this series overall. Dektum and Kellen again pull out the Lucian Nami, and again are just able to win lane. There's really not a lot of investment from Krako into that bottom lane, a lot more going into closer on this Ahri in the mid lane, which again, I would just ban out, honestly. But a lot more investment going into closer in this mid lane, and it didn't work. Showmaker was able to get that lead. I think they wanted to punish Showmaker, who had been, quote-unquote having a down year, right? But it's still Showmaker. He's still able to show up in moments where it matters the most, and he certainly did in the series. And then, like I said, Dektum and Kellen really just dominated the bottom lane. But shout out to Nuguri, who really bodied Dove, not only in this game 4, but just in this series overall. Game 1, Nuguri dominated him. Game 3, Nuguri dominated him. Game 4, it was a domination Like, it was never close in the series. Like, he just had his number every single game. If they had played in game 2, I think this probably would have been a 3-0 sweep for DAMWON. But for SANDBOX in game number 4, tough loss. Obviously, you don't want to see yourself get put into this position where now it's, one more series to decide whether or not you go to Worlds. But you're not out of the World Championships just yet. It's not over by any means. You just have a lot of things you need to figure out. One, Dove in the top lane. He has been a little bit of an issue, not only throughout the regular season, but certainly throughout the playoffs. He got abused by Gen G. He was not nearly on the same level as Doran in the Gen G series, and then it was even worse in this DAMWON series when Nuguri was really able to get some power picks and be able to take over that top lane, really push him, even on a pick like Ornn where he just has to play safe and group up in teamfights later. Like, he was so far behind that he couldn't even tank properly. Like, he was abused. He's my dead of the game here in game number 3, or my game number 4. He was also the dead of the game in game number 3. Just not a good series at all from Dove, and that's definitely, like, I'm hitting the panic button on Dove. I don't think he's going to be a top laner that's going to be able to hold up against any of the remotely good top laners in the world. Like, if they get to Worlds, this is somebody that's going to be a huge, huge question mark for them. I will say, when it comes to Krako and Closer, good and bad. Closer looked good on the games of Ahri that he played in this series, but I'm very concerned when teams figure out that if we just ban Ahri and Akali from SANDBOX, Closer either has to pick the very weak LeBlanc, or he has to go onto a pick that he's just not as comfortable on. He's not as good on the Taliyah. He's not as good on the Sylas. We know that. And so, I mean, the Sylas I think he could play, but the Taliyah we know he's not as good on. The Lissandra we know he's not as good on. Like, these other quote-unquote meta picks, especially any control mage, like, he's just not able to play at a competitive level. And so, if you take him off of these Ahri Akali picks, like, what ends up happening to Closer? That's something I'm going to be interested to see. We saw it a little bit in game number 3 where he had to go to his third choice LeBlanc, and he looked miserable because that champion just isn't strong enough. Krako also just got out-jungled in this series by Canyon, who was really, really solid. And Prince and Kayle, they weren't the problem in this series, but again, they're the players that need to be taking over these games in order to give SANDBOX a chance to win. I'm not going to say it was their fault, because again, they're in losing matchups and they're not really given a lot of expertise, and everybody else around on the map is losing on their side. But at the same time, like, it's not like this has been new to Liiv SANDBOX. This is kind of how they played all year long, but Prince just didn't have the opportunity to carry in these games. I'm not saying that Krako should just AFK everything and go bot lane, but, investing into that player might be a little bit smarter. And Prince, like, for his part, has to play more aggressive. Obviously, he didn't want to be the one to make a mistake in the series, but by the end of the series, he didn't really have any impact. Like, I barely mentioned his name, him or Kayle, at any point in the series because he didn't really do anything. He wasn't the problem, but he also wasn't really doing anything to push the team forward, to keep the team in the game. And so, definitely some worrying things for SANDBOX, but they're going to have the chance to recuperate. They're going to be playing the winner of KT Rolster and DRX, which we'll talk about in just a bit. For that last spot at Worlds, they definitely still have a shot. Those two teams should theoretically be on, like, a tier below them, but this loss is definitely a little bit concerning because it's pretty anti what has been happening to Liiv all year long, and kind of what I've been saying has been my biggest concern with Liiv all year long, which is that they're not going to be able to hold up when Prince isn't able to just take over the game. As for DAMWON, you got to be really excited with them qualifying for Worlds. They're not going to have to play in play-ins because they're the 3 seed coming out of the LCK. That's good for them. They get a lot of time to prep now. Obviously, I imagine they're going to say, all right, well, this proves that Nuguri's the better top laner, and I hope they go with him for group stage, for Worlds, just in general. But player of the series here, I think you could go with a few people. Nuguri obviously comes to mind because of the pure impact that he had in the 3 games that he played, but I'm going to give player of the series to Canyon in the jungle. Obviously, not the most dominant game 4 here, and game 2 certainly wasn't perfect, especially towards the end, but games 1 and 3 were literally won by Canyon, in my opinion. I definitely think that he deserves player of the series here. Again, if you wanted to give it to Nuguri, I'm not going to blame you. Showmaker, also definitely in the conversation. Overall, just a really good series from DAMWON. They're going to be very happy to move on, and their LCK season is over, as now they are moving on to the World Championships. So congratulations to them, and I hope they can continue to grow and kind of get back to that DAMWON form that we knew before this year, rather than what we've seen for the most part in the regular season. All right, now that we know which team in the LCK is going to be moving on to Worlds as the number 3 seed, it's time to see who is going to be facing off against Liiv SANDBOX for the chance to go to Worlds as the number 4 seed. Definitely an interesting series. This is the series that I think I was more excited to watch here, as I was really, really entertained, and I wanted to see how two teams who, quite frankly, have been moving in very different directions this season would face off against each other in a best of 5. So we have our number 5 seeded KT Rolster taking on our number 6 seeded DRX. And very intriguing matchup between these two teams. Obviously, KT Rolster, a team that I don't think a lot of people had the expectations of being like a top team in the LCK. I know I've been a lot lower on this team throughout most of the year. My comment section has been sure to fill me in on that, but they've definitely overexceeded even the highest of expectations, at one point even coming close to beating Gen G in a regular season series, really showing up in a way that a lot of people didn't expect, mostly because of Rascal and Aiming really being able to step up and take over a lot of the game, and Vikla coming in the mid lane and really being a surprisingly great addition to this team. As for DRX, kind of the opposite. This is a team that I think a lot of people had pegged for being a pretty easy slot in for the World Championship slots. Like, they were a top 4 team for most people going into the year. They could never really hold on to that spot, mostly due to ridiculous amounts of inconsistency. I talked about this when I talked about them in the playoff primer, but the consistency of this team to go from 2-0 to 0-2 to 2-0 to 0-2 is actually absurd from week to week, and honestly, they continued that throughout the playoffs. They really weren't able to get any sort of consistent footing against Liiv SANDBOX in the first round, so they find themselves here in the 5-6 matchup. How do I think these teams fare against each other? Well, I certainly think both have advantages. I think KT is significantly more consistent, but I think, when you're talking about the highs of each team, DRX, I think, reaches just a tad bit higher than KT, so it's going to be interesting. Is the DRX that's going to show up today, are they going to be the good one or the bad one? That's really going to determine how this series goes. So, let's go ahead and take a look and see which one we got here today by starting with game number 1. And game number 1 here was a DRX win, a big game number 1 win. Obviously, game 1 becoming less and less important as we can see as the playoffs go onwards, with teams being, more likely to come back and be able to win 3 games in a row. But DRX going to be happy to get this early lead, and this was a very close game, honestly, between the two teams. Got to give a lot of credit to Zika in the mid lane for DRX. He has kind of been the guy, in my opinion, for DRX throughout the majority of this split. You can talk about some of the games that he's had that have been bad, but when this team wins, it is often because of Zika. I know a lot of people talk about how it's Deft and 4 players that he has to carry on his back, but quite frankly, they don't really invest into Deft all that much on this team. He really isn't the carry of DRX. While he doesn't really make a lot of mistakes, he also isn't really the one that's driving a lot of the wins forward. Most of that has been Zika. At times, it's been Kingen as well. Those 2 solo lanes have been the 2 that they've really wanted to invest in, and they kind of left Deft on an island in the bottom lane. Now, it's kind of worked out for them mostly because Deft is so consistent at not losing, but it very much can sometimes get to the point where if Zika and Kingen aren't winning, it can be very difficult to win. Luckily for them, Zika gets on the Sylas, one of his better picks from the regular season. He's able to completely outplay Vikla. The Sylas Taliyah matchup is something that I would expect to see significantly more. I do think they are the 2 best picks in the meta right now. We've seen a lot of people, though, moving away from that Taliyah pick in the mid lane, and that's very interesting in my opinion, because I do think it is very strong if you can play it at a high level. I just know a lot of people don't like playing for the more supportive style, but PO shit coming out here in game number 1. Obviously, sometimes you get PO sick, sometimes you get PO shit. This time, he played really well in game number 1, I should say. He was able to navigate the early game on the Wukong really well. Into the Sejuani, I always talk about this with the Sej. You should be able to take advantage of her slow pathing early, and Pioshik did a good job making sure Zika was on a good path to be able to take over the game. Deft and Beryl honestly just won by themselves in the bot lane. They were able to group up towards the back half of the game. Beryl was super useful on the Yuumi, and Deft was there on the Zeri. Not really the hyper carry that, Zeri can tend to be, but not bad. Like, the rest of the team was fed, so I don't really blame him too much. And then you had King in the top lane on the Fiora. Obviously, the counter pick here to the Aatrox. You want to try to get that Aatrox to split out wide a little bit more often. Aatrox obviously wants to get to that point in the mid to late game where he can just flank on a team fight and be able to sit amongst all the damage, kind of being that disruption while your Sivir is able to hit on the back line. And while your Nautilus and Sejuani are dealing with the front line to make sure that Taliyah has an easier access. Like, things like that. You want to see from the Aatrox, but drafting the Fiora here for DRX kind of forces at least somebody on this team to be a lot more passive and a lot more side lane oriented, because somebody has to be there to stop the Fiora, especially if she does get golden well. She wasn't like ridiculously fed in this game or anything like that. Kingen was still a problem, and you still had to pay attention. So overall, I would say a good draft by DRX and a good execution. Zika played really well. He's going to get my player of the game here in the mid lane. A lot of the game ended up flowing through him on the Sylas. Pioshik spent a lot of time making sure that Sylas was in a good spot, and then being able to play around objectives towards the back half of the game with Deft and Beryl, I should say, and doing a really good job of that. Kingen obviously creating a lot of pressure elsewhere. Overall, DRX just played a really, really solid game. This felt like a very good DRX game. Like, it was very typical of how they tended to win in the regular season, where Kingen would kind of just be off in a side lane doing his own thing. if Pyosik could have a decent early game and Zika could really take over in the mid game, they often won a lot of their games, and that's exactly what happened here. As for KT Rolster, little bit of a rough loss here in game number 1. Obviously not the end of the world or anything, but you kind of just got out macroed in this game, which is a little bit of a disappointment. I'm going to give dud of the game here to Rascal in the top lane. I think I'm going to settle on it. There have been a couple people that I've, debated giving it to, but I'm going to settle on giving it to Rascal in the top lane. Like I said, picking the Aatrox blind here is definitely a little bit of a problem, but I think the King and counter pick just generally made that even worse. And so Rascal had this situation where he had to get ahead early. He had to make sure Kingen was not fed on this Fiora, and he couldn't quite do that. He had no help from a Sejuani in the top lane. Pyosik did a good job of making sure to shadow Fiora anytime she needed that assistance to make sure Aatrox couldn't get any of that extra assistance. And by the end game, he really was just kind of useless. He didn't have the gold to be able to flank in team fights, and he certainly wasn't going to be able to duel the Fiora 1v1, so he just wasn't really going to be able to do anything in this game. So Rascal gets my dud of the game in game number 1. But I think you could realistically give this to a few people. Cuz got outplayed by Pyosik, but mostly, in my opinion, this was champion diff. Sejuani should be able to be punished like this. I talk about this all the time. We've seen Sejuanis be able to come out and win early game matchups, mostly because the players are straight just better. But in this game, Pyosik did a good job of making sure that he knew the matchup and he knew when to take advantage of the Sejuani, which was in the early game, making sure Zika got that mid-game ball rolling, and then you could kind of just, play from there. Even if Sejuani was able to get early objectives, Pyosik was able to make sure to trade for a lot of early gold. So interesting plays here from both teams, but I think overall, DRX played it better. I think you could talk about a few ways for KT to improve in game number 2. Obviously, I'd like to see something a little bit more aggressive in the early game. You play very heavily for the late game in this draft. You've got the Aatrox, you've got the Sedge, you've got the Sivir. Nothing really to push that tempo forward in the early game. You kind of hoped that would have been Taliyah, but the Sylas just got too big of a lead, and at that point, he's going to be just as big of a roam threat as the Taliyah can be because his damage outcoming and his ability to just not die is significantly higher than what Taliyah is going to be offering, and so overall, at that point, you just didn't really have that facilitator in the early game, so I would expect them to go to something a little bit more consistent in that regard, but for DRX, I like what they were able to do here. You draft the Wukong to be able to facilitate some lanes that are able to take over in the late game. This is an idea that I have really come around to. I was kind of out on early game junglers, quote unquote, but I really do think if you surround them with more late game focused picks, if you have the Wukong that's able to push the tempo early, make sure that the lanes are able to get ahead, then you can have the good players be able to snowball in some of these late game picks, and the Wukong is allowed to fall off where he doesn't have to be nearly as important in the back half if he doesn't have like a bajillion gold. So overall, really like DRX's draft. I expect them to go back to something similar. As for KT, I would expect a little bit more tempo pushing in the draft that we get in game number 2. But are they able to do that? Is DRX going to be able to maintain their lead in this series with a really good game number 2? Or is KT Rolster going to bounce back and send us to a best of 3, basically make this a regular season matchup between 2 really interesting teams? Well, in game number 2, we had a KT Rolster win. So KT picks up a really important game 2, really sets themselves back up for a good spot here in the last few games. And it was mostly off of some really good play out of the mid-jungle duo, but we got to talk about draft first and foremost. You may be looking at these two drafts and being like, what a weird combination that KT Rolster pulled out here. Jax, like, Neela, and by the way, it's apparently Neela. I've been saying it wrong in my videos. I'll try to fix that. I might still say Nyla, but I've been saying it wrong. Apologies to that. And then the Zyra in the support, a very bold Zyra pick, something we really haven't been seeing all that much in the meta, even if I think it could be relatively okay, like as an aggressive, punishing pick on something like a Zeri, at least in terms of laning phase. You're not really going to be doing much out of it, but like just as an early lane punisher, potentially could be something. It turns out the Zyra was random picked by KT. Vikla was running out of time in Champion Select, and just random picked the Zyra, and they had to play it, and you know what? They won. So I can't even be mad. The Zyra kind of worked in lane. Wasn't really all that useful, but, it was still a good pick. Most of this game was, again, through the jungle mid-duo of KT Rolster, who really stepped up. And honestly, this jungle mid-duo has been playing so much better in the second half of the season than they ever were towards the beginning half. I was really making a case for Cuz to be, like, the worst jungler in the LCK, or at least one of them over the course of, like, the first 5 weeks of the season, but him and Vikla, ever since Vikla came in and got the full-time starting job, I think have really developed a better chemistry than him and Arya had on this team. And with Vikla getting better every single week, I think Cuz has also started to get his rhythm, his groove back every single week. And he was really good in this game here on the Poppy. So much so that he's going to get my player of the game in game number 2 here. was just able to take over the whole map. Pyosik on the Trundle was very passive in this game, really was not looking for any sort of confrontation, really was not looking for any sort of, like, contest in any scenario, which is confusing to me. I know a lot of people talk about this being a Trundle-favored matchup. I've disagreed with that. Not that it's not, I just think it's more neutral than people give it credit for, but even at worst, if it's at worst neutral for Pyosik. So I don't really understand why he was playing this game so safe and so passively, but Cuz was here, and he was able to take over the map, was really able to push through with Vikla in that mid lane, whereas Zika kind of got a lot of those advantages on the Sylas in game number 1. Those advantages were translated to the other side here with Vikla on the Sylas, and he played really, really well in the mid game, very similar to what Zika was able to do in game number 1, where basically he was just able to take over the whole map after getting a gold lead in the early part of the game. Now, the Sylas Azir matchup I do think is relatively Sylas favored, mostly just because in the mid game he can just leave, like, he can shove the wave and go away, and I think that that's pretty good in this meta just overall. But, you know, Azir definitely still scales really, really well and should be a threat in the later half of the game. Unfortunately, Zika played the back half of this game really, really poorly. He's going to get my dud of the game for DRX here, as he really just wasn't able to do all that much. Not only was he outplayed by Vikla pretty heavily in the early to mid game here, but I think overall him and Pyosik just weren't a factor at all in this game, and that's a big problem because, like I said, this DRX team really, really relies on a player like Zika to be able to win his lane and move that advantage into the late game. But when he can't do that, quite frankly, and I know I'm going to get some hate for this, Deft really hasn't been the player this year that's going to win you a game by himself. He just has not been that in the majority of the games for DRX. He's been fine. He's never really been a huge problem, but he's not the guy that's going to plant his flag and say, I'm going to win this game by myself. I just haven't seen it that way. Zika has been the guy that's been able to push this DRX team forward. When he's not playing well, they just do not win games. And so with him, unfortunately, not playing all that well in game number 2 here, they're just not able to have enough firepower to pick up the win, especially when he's on a champion as important to this comp as Azir, where you're really relying on someone like a Deft to be able to secondary carry, and like I just said, he's just not going to be able to do that. So not a great game from DRX, but a good game from KT Rolster. You got to be really excited about this. Cuz coming out and really outperforming Pyosik is a good sign. Obviously, both of these junglers have definitely struggled at multiple points throughout the season, but Cuz has definitely been on an upward trajectory, where I think Pyosik has been the opposite, on much more of a downward trajectory throughout the split. And so definitely, if Cuz can keep this up, can continue to be a player of the game on a more supportive pick, that he can just enable players like Vikla or a player like Rascal, we didn't even really talk about on the Jax in this game, to be able to do a lot of good stuff for the team overall. I think that's going to be positive for KT Rolster. You're also relying, like I said, on a lot of your quote-unquote carry pieces to step up, which the good thing is you have a lot of them. Obviously, Aiming is a good player. He plays the Neela in this game, and he's fine. Him and Zyra in this game were fine overall. They didn't really have much of an impact, but they certainly weren't a problem, and they kept Zeri from being too much of an issue in the mid game. But you got to give a lot of credit to Vikla in the mid lane, who I talked about being kind of the central focus in a lot of these team fights. On the Sylas, being able to roam to a lot of the objectives, making sure that Cuz was pretty much always backed up in whatever macro play that he wanted to make. But big shout out to Rascal. I just talked about Kingan in the last game, picking up that Fiora and forcing basically the enemy team to make a choice. You do a very similar thing here with the Jax. He's going to be in that side lane. He's going to be pressuring a lot of these waves. You're going to force DRX to make that choice. Do you want to take the Sejuani or the Trundle out of a team fight? A very important piece in those team fights. Do you want to take them out and make it a 4v4 so that you can match the Jax? Or is the Jax just going to be able to run wild? It's going to be one of the two, and that sets KT Rolster up in a really good spot, and they're able to capitalize. So overall, just a really good game from KT. Really, really positive showing that they had here in game number 2. And they even up the series here at 1-1. So now we move into game number 3. And game number 3, obviously, a super important one. In my opinion, you know, other than game 5, game 3 is the most important game in the series. The odd number games tend to be like that, because you can get into situations where winning them can put you in a much better scenario where you just don't have to lose 2 games in a row to move on. And I think both teams are going to be looking to put themselves in that spot. So who is able to take the pivotal game number 3 in this series? Is it going to be KT? Is it going to be DRX? Well, game number 3 went to KT as they pick up another win here in game number 3, putting themselves up 2-1 in the series. Only 1 game away from moving on to play for that 4th seed at Worlds. And it was a good game here in game number 3. Honestly, if I'm being real, I don't really love the draft. A lot of my draft faux pas are being committed by KT Rolster in this game. And honestly, DRX commits a lot of the draft suggestions that I do in this game. But as I always go back to saying on this channel, you can only talk about draft so much, because at the end of the day, execution is significantly more important than draft. And we saw that in this one. Even if I do think DRX had a little bit of a better draft in this, I think KT Rolster's execution was so much better that it didn't really matter that a lot of the pieces that KT had on the board weren't all that useful in the grand scheme of things if they were just able to pilot them better. Case in point, Sion in the top lane, a pick that I have been very vocal on this channel about. Just, I don't think it's very good. Pretty much every single time that we've seen it in competitive, it's really not accomplished all that much. I get it. Infinitely scaling top laner tank is good, but really, I just don't think he accomplishes any of the goals that maybe the other tank top laners do, whether it be Ornn, whether it be Sejuani. Hell, you have the Sejuani in this game, and then you also pivot to a tank top laner. He also doesn't really give you the same kind of damage that an off tank in the top lane does, something like a Gnar. And I just don't really get it. Like, I don't think he really gives you either of the both worlds. He's like the worst of both worlds, in all honesty, but Rascal is just straight up better than Kingen as a player, and so he's able to pilot the Sion in a way that he's able to generate a pretty large lead in this game on Kingen's Gragas. And he's able to keep that. He's able to be effective in the sense of when he runs in and he does, hit the front line, it's not entirely useless because he is able to effectively be able to do damage because of the lead he was able to generate on his own in that top lane. But as much as I want to talk about Rascal being the focal point of this game, it was another mid-jungle diff here for KT Rolster, and you've got to be excited as a KT fan. Well, maybe not too excited. You don't want to get too excited. But another great game from Cuz and another great game from Vikla, the two members of this team that, quite frankly, I was the most concerned about going into serious playoff matchups, because Cuz has been very, very inconsistent throughout the year. Vikla, obviously being a rookie, I think his contributions to this KT team have been a little overhyped, maybe in the grand scheme of things. I think he has been a good player, but this has really been aiming in Rascal's team for the majority of the year. And really, it seems like Cuz and Vikla have really been stepping up in this series so far. Cuz got my player of the game in game 2. Vikla is going to get it in game number 3 here on the Taliyah. This goes back to what I was saying earlier. I really think Taliyah is a super underrated pick at this point in the meta. I think everybody knows she's strong, but people have just kind of stopped picking her up. And I think that's a mistake. No one's really banning her. If she's going to be available, I think she offers you so many flexible options. Not only is she actually dangerous in the lane in the 1v1 threat against certain matchups, not against every matchup, but in certain matchups, but the actual macro experience that she gives you in the mid lane as opposed to anybody else in the game. That includes Ahri, that includes Sylas, that includes all these other picks that I think are good right now. I think Taliyah is just really, really awesome in that respect. Do I think she's as strong as Sylas? No. Do I think she has a good matchup into Sylas? Yes. And so I often like to think of Taliyah as a go-to mid laner here, and DRX bans out LeBlanc instead. What exactly are they thinking? So, Vikla plays really, really well here. He's able to generate a huge lead on Zika in the mid lane, mostly due to Cuz's interference on the Sejuani. Another good game from Cuz here on the Sej to be able to take over. But Vikla does carry this game. Like, his damage is absolutely absurd. After he's able to get a few kills on him, he's able to pretty much take over every single objective fight. He's always there first. The walls are beautiful. The damage is plentiful. Zeri can't dash around because of the ground. So honestly, just a great game from Taliyah. If she's able to take over a game like this, she is a huge problem to deal with. This is what we saw a player like Xiaohu do very effectively for most of the year on RNG. I'm glad to see Vikla picking up that Taliyah and being able to carry on it. But big shout out to Cuz as well for being able to enable Vikla, being able to enable Rascal into a situation where they're just able to win their lanes basically by themselves. He outplays Pyosik again. Pyosik a little bit more aggressive on the Wukong this time, but at the same time, like, Wukong should be able to destroy Sejuani in the early game, but Cuz got some really, really crucial ganks off and was able to keep up and farm with the Wukong, which quite frankly just should never happen. The clear should be slower. You shouldn't be able to match what Wukong is doing, and overall, I think it's just an indictment on what Pyosik is doing, and a big positive for what Cuz has been able to do in this series. Aiming and life were fine, but again, not the focal point of this game on the Lucian Nami. For the DRX side, another bad game from Zika here on Azir, and there's really no other way to talk about this DRX team as a whole other than, like, they have such poor macro when behind that it's really, really hard to imagine a world in which they make giant comebacks. If they play well in the early game, if Zika or Kingen can get rolling in the early game, DRX is often setting themselves up for a very good mid game because those players are very good at transitioning a lead into the mid game, or at least they have been in the summer split so far. But man, when this team goes down early, when Pyosik gets out jungled in the early game, and Zika gets completely beaten in the 1v1, obviously a little bit of jungle attention from Cuz, but generally speaking, Vikla was just straight up the better player in this game. they are doomed, like completely doomed. I talked about this again. It's very similar to what happened in game 2. Zika gets put on this late game pick that really, really needs to take over in the late game for them to have a chance to succeed, and he goes down so far early game, and they have nobody else on this roster that is going to be able to win the game for them. They rely significantly too much on the presence of their mid laner to be able to win in the late game, and when he loses, it's a disaster for DRX. So 2 bad games in a row for Zika mean 2 losses in a row for DRX, and it's definitely disappointing. You can say it's not Deft's fault, and I agree with you. Deft really isn't making a lot of the mistakes here, but I'm tired of seeing the posts that, oh, Deft deserved better in his last year. Deft can carry these games. It is possible for Zeri to get a lead in these games. Obviously, you want more attention and things like that, but it is possible for Deft to be able to at least put DRX in a better position, and it just doesn't feel like he is that kind of player anymore. He's gonna look good when he's not the central focus of the team, but when he has to be the #1 guy, he just can't live up to that right now. He hasn't been able to do that at all in the summer split, in my opinion. At no point in the summer split has Deft been the guy for DRX, and that's been a little bit disappointing, and, you know, I really would expect more from him, so very much looking forward to seeing how this team rebounds, but not a good look in games 2 and game 3 here. Like, it's pretty much the opposite of what you want to see. You want to see Zika thriving, and you want to see him be able to generate a lead on a rookie player like Vikla in the mid lane. You want to see Pyosik be able to use his aggressive tendencies to be able to outplay someone who tends to overextend like Cuz, but in the end, it's the opposite that's happening. They're the 2 that are getting picked apart, and Cuz and Vikla are the 2 that are carrying KT Rolster to a really good spot here. Now, obviously, the series isn't over. It's just 2-1. We've seen quite a few comebacks in the playoffs so far, but DRX are going to have to switch things up. The early game has to go better for them. Their macro in the mid to late game is awful when they don't have a lead on their mid laner, and so, really, I think a lot of this is going to have to be a draft diff. I'm usually an advocate for going for these more late game scaling picks with maybe an early game jungler. You have to have more agency in the early game. It is simply not working. KT just needs to keep this up. They went to my game 1 prediction, which is the fact that they wanted more agency in the early game. They started playing more aggressive. They drafted the Talia. They drafted the Lucian Nami. They started going for more of these picks, but still had the scaling tanks to be able to help out in the mid to late game like the Sejuani. And so I just want them to keep going with this. These have been 2 very, very good games. If you get 1 good game out of aiming, Life, Cuz, Vikla, you know, whatever, right? Like, you're probably going to be in a spot to just win the series here. And you have the luxury of being able to test things out in game number 4. So a very, very big game number 4, obviously, because it's win or go home in terms of Worlds qualification for DRX, but can they do it? Can they take down KT and put themselves in a spot to at least give themselves a shot at a game number 5? Well, the winner of game number 4 was DRX. They are able to take game number 4 and push the series to a game 5, and you gotta be excited about that, but what exactly happened in game number 4? How did DRX get their lead here, and what exactly did they do with it? Well, first of all, substitution, change in the jungle. Pyosik is out. Juhan is in here. Now, obviously, we've seen Juhan in the regular season for DRX, and that's great. Like, it's a very pivotal time for them to go to not a rookie jungler, because obviously he's been to MSI, he was playing on PSG Talon, but someone who doesn't really have any experience in the LCK. It's a very, very pivotal time for you to go to him here in basically a win-or-go-home world spot, and he really, I mean, while he wasn't perfect this game, he definitely delivered an upgrade to what Pyosik was able to offer, because DRX at least had a semi-competent early game in this one. Yes, there were some definite trading decisions, but at least those decisions were giving them options, and I really did like it. And some people are going to like what they did, some people are not going to like what they did. They basically gave up dragons. Like, they said, screw it, we're not getting first dragon, we're not getting second dragon, we're not getting third dragon. We're not even trying to get these dragons. We're not going to try to compete. We're going to take our pressure and we're going to move it across the map to make sure that we get tower after tower after tower. And that's exactly what they did. They were able to get a lot of these objectives, and that put them in a situation where they were actually at a gold lead, even though they weren't really able to contest for a lot of the neutral objectives on the map. That's a situation you don't often find yourselves in, but Juhan did a really good job of making sure to transition that pressure. Obviously, I don't love DRX's draft in this game. Camille Vi, I think, is very risky. It's very all-in. And honestly, there really aren't a lot of good targets on KT Rolster to go in on. You have a very tanky team. You've got the Aatrox, you got the Sedge, you've got the Swain in the mid lane. It's not like there's a very easily picked off person out of that group. It's really just the Lucian that you want to be going in on over and over again. But at the same time, if you go in and in on Lucian, then you're really just setting up Aatrox and Swain to be put in a good position towards the backline of your team. So you had to play this, you know, the last half of this game really carefully, and that's where I think DRX really, really stood out. Is, yes, I think obviously the early game was a lot better, and they were able to get, you know, at least a gold neutral situation going in towards the back half of this game. But they gave up Dragon Soul. The other team had Infernal Soul in this game, and you were still able to beat them in a lot of these team fights, mostly because Juhan, Beryl, and especially Zika were absolutely enormous towards the back half here. I've said it 800 times. I've said it in all 3 of the first games. I'll say it again here. When Zika is online for this team has a good shot at winning games. He really has been that influential in what DRX is doing. I hope this series finally opens some people's eyes and they start listening, because I see so many people saying, like, this is Def's team. Def is the only one doing anything. Zika is the decider of whether or not this team wins or loses by himself. He was really, really good in this game on Azir. Outplayed everybody on KT Rolster to the point where he was dominating these late game team fights with perfect positioning and unbelievable, like, damage output. Completely reawakened from the games 2 and 3. Really good bounce back from him. He's going to get my player of the game here in game number 4. A phenomenal game on Azir. Obviously, the pick that he had lost and got basically obliterated on in games 2 and game 3 here. And so, really, really good to see the confidence in him to pull it back out in game number 4 and to be able to dominate on it. I certainly wouldn't have gone back to it, but if he's going to be this good on it, then, you know, be my guest, right? Like, if he's going to be able to win these late game team fights, that's the reason you pick the Azir for him in the first place, is so that he can get to the point in the late game where you can rely on him to be the main guy. Def doesn't have to be that guy on Zeri. He can be a more insular, supportive piece for this team. He can do a lot of damage, but Beryl can mostly be on Zika. And then you can have Kingen and Juhan being, quote-unquote, the semi-frontline, going in, but not going all the way in, really just occupying a lot of the enemy team, really aiming in a spot where if he steps up too far, he just dies, and making sure that Rascal and Vikla don't have the opportunity to get on the Azir or the Zeri as easily as they would like to. Overall, DRX played these late game team fights very, very well, and this is a stark difference to the DRX that we were seeing just a game ago, and so it's really, really good to see that Juhan coming in. You know, I'm not going to say it was entirely him, because it wasn't a perfect game from him in the jungle, but he certainly was able to make decisions, even if they weren't, quote-unquote, the perfect decisions, and those decisions at least led to DRX having a shot in the late game, and they capitalized on that. As for KT Rolster, you had a little bit of an early game lead, and honestly, you utilized it well. You were able to get Infernal Soul in this game, which is absolutely huge. Infernal Soul should just be a free late game teamfight win, if I'm being completely honest, but you got to the point in the game where you don't really have all those, you know, a big damage threat. You have the Lucian, and theoretically Swain should be that, but Vikla just wasn't all that good in this game. He just kind of got outplayed by Zika in laning phase, and then especially towards the back half of the game, Zika was doing a great job to make sure that Vikla's ultimate wasn't really getting on a lot of targets. He was able to control him not only with his own ultimate, but just by being in a good position and being able to output a ton of damage onto that Swain over and over again. So Vikla is actually going to get my dud of the game here in game number 4. He's been very good over the course of the last 2 games, but definitely a little bit of an issue here in game number 4. Outside of that, though, everybody else was also not that good in the team fight. While Cuz did a good job of generating a lot of leads in this game, he really wasn't able to do anything in the later half of this game. Obviously, Infernal Soul doesn't help him nearly as much as it helps somebody like the Lucian or the Swain, but at the same time, like, his frontlining ability was basically non-existent towards the back half of the game. The ultimates were not hitting. This has been kind of a problem with Cuz, where even if he does get a good early game, his team fighting skills really aren't perfect. I'm not going to overreact. He's been very good in this series so far, but definitely not a great game from Cuz and Vikla, and then Rascal just wasn't able to get on anybody. Aiming and Life, even though they were able to generate an early lead again here on the Lucian Nami over Deft and Beryl, just weren't able to capitalize on it. So in the end, generally, just a good game from DRX. Like, you've got to be excited. You got to be excited to see someone like Juhan come in. And honestly, like, this team looked better because of it, at least in game number 4. I'm not going to say that he's a better player than Pioshik or anything like that, but Pioshik has certainly been on a little bit of a downward trend in the recent weeks. And if Juhan can come in and kind of reinvigorate what this team wants to do, even if they're not making the perfect calls, at least they're making direct calls and they're not playing this scattered game. I think that can be a really big positive for DRX, and you know, I would keep him in for game number 5. At least that's what I would do. Zika obviously played really well here. If you can enable him, you're going to win the game. That's just been the case for DRX all year long. And so it's really interesting to see what's going to happen. We move now into a huge game number 5. Obviously, the loser is eliminated from Worlds contention. Their season is over, and the winner gets a chance to take on Liiv SANDBOX for that final spot at the World Championships out of the LCK. It's a big, big game for both of these teams, and both teams are going to have to step up. So who is going to do it? Which team is going to be the one that makes their case here in game number 5 to move on? It is going to be DRX. They are able to take a game number 5. They come back from being down 2-1 in this series to KT, and they punch their ticket to face Liiv SANDBOX in the finals of the regional qualifier here in the LCK. A great game from DRX. One of the least close games of the series here, and DRX is just the better team by a considerable margin here in game number 5, and you love to see it if you're a DRX fan. I mean, this was really everything that you wanted to see and more. Juhan did stay in here for game number 5, and he made it count. Not only was he making a lot of early plays here on the Wukong, playing the Wukong Sejuani matchup, how it should be, with just playing super aggro as the Wukong, kind of punishing the slow clear of the Sedge so that she doesn't have a chance to match a lot of what you're doing. He did that really well, investing in Zika in the early game, making sure Swain got to a point where he was super strong, punishing Vikla over and over again for being overextended and being out of position, and then making sure Deft in the bot lane was also in a spot on the Xayah where he could play really well. A very, very rare Xayah pick here from Deft, something we're really not seeing in this meta all that much, especially without Rakan. It's pretty much perma with Rakan, so to see Xayah Yuumi here, definitely an interesting call, but who am I to argue? It definitely worked out in this game. So overall, great one for DRX, but you gotta give a lot of credit to Juhan, and you gotta give credit to Deft. I know I've been, crapping on him a little bit in this series and, this year so far. It's certainly not because I think Deft is a bad player. In fact, go back and see the words that I've said. I've said he's incredibly consistent. That's really what he is, right? Is he someone who's not really going to lose you the game? I've just been a little bit underwhelmed with his ability to actively be a takeover piece, a guy that you can build around and put everything into and who will win the game for you, be the major piece. He really hasn't been that for a ton of this year, but he was that in this game on the Xayah, especially towards the back half. Barrel on the Yuumi is a huge pick for this team because Barrel tends to int on a lot of picks that aren't that. You put him on the Yuumi, you put him with the Xayah here, and Deft is really able to play a little bit more aggressive in this lane, which is something that, quite frankly, he just hasn't done at all this year. You're going into the Neela Sona lane, a very intriguing one here. I really don't understand the Sona pick, especially with Seraphine on the board. I would see that as just kind of a Sona upgrade, if you will, but if you want to go for the Sona, be my guest here. Deft was able to take advantage of that weak laning phase. Obviously, Zika was certainly able to take advantage of a weak laning phase in the mid lane here as he completely destroyed Vikla. Really, it wasn't even all that close. Zika was significantly better here in game number 5, which is good to see if you're a DRX fan. Juhan out-jungled Cuz. Kingen versus Rascal. Even though Rascal was able to generate a lead here, it wasn't really all that important in the end of the game here because, they just grouped as 5 and won the game, so you could kind of ignore the fact that Jax was side laning in this instance, mostly because the rest of the team just had no chance in the 5v4, and Jax couldn't push fast enough, so it really was over at that point. But, Rascal was the only player on KT that even played remotely okay. DRX actually just dominated this game. A really, really dominant game from DRX, so you gotta be happy for this team. As for KT, definitely disappointing to see them get knocked out here, but I'm not all that surprised. This team had a lot of flaws, and they really outperformed, I think, a lot of their talent levels in the regular season. Players like Rascal are very, very good, and I really like the development of players like Vikla, but Cuz really isn't the guy that should be consistently winning in top, 6 series. He's just not that kind of jungler anymore. And then Aiming and Life, while they've been very good this season, were completely irrelevant in this series. I don't want to, shit on them too hard, but, they did not show up. They were nowhere to be seen. They weren't necessarily the problem in any of these losses, but they weren't good either. I think very similar to what I said about Prince and Kale in the series earlier in this video. It's just you've been kind of the focal point of this team throughout the entire year, and this was not the series to take off. This was not the series to not invest in the player that's kind of been carrying you, and I'm not going to blame it entirely on Aiming in Life, but at the same time, it's not like you weren't given picks to be able to take over the game on. You got to play some Sivir, you got to play some Neela. These are picks you can win the game on, and very much did not see that out of Aiming or Life in this series. So definitely a little disappointed in the KT bot lane, but overall, I think for the season as a whole, you're going to be relatively positive about KT. They certainly, I think, exceeded expectations. There were moments where they felt like a top 4 team in the region. There were moments where they didn't feel like a top 4 team in the region. But at the end of the day, I think you have a lot of pieces to build around here, whether you want to keep them or not. I actually like 4 of the 5 pieces on this team. I think Rascal, Vikla, Aiming, and Life are all pieces that I would at least consider keeping. Cuz is someone who he definitely improved towards the back half of the split, but definitely someone I would probably look to move on from now that your season is over. But I don't know contract situations. I'll get into all that in my off-season videos. But for now, definitely you have to hold your head up high for KT. Making it this far was probably a good result in terms of 2022. As for DRX, your season is not over yet. You now get to play a best-of-5 against Liiv SANDBOX for the opportunity to go to the World Championships. And we'll preview that in just a second. But big props to DRX. Not only did they play this game well, they really showed that with Juhan coming in here, maybe they do have the potential to be consistent enough to, achieve the expectations that I think a lot of people, me included, had for this team at the beginning of the year, which is that they should have been a shoo-in for top 4. If they can continue this pace, I actually think the SANDBOX series might be a little bit more interesting than it was in the first round of the playoffs, but that's a lot of ifs. Right now, you're just going to be celebrating the fact that you've given yourself a chance. You definitely have some roster decisions to make for that series, and it's going to make it very intriguing. But for now, you've got to be excited that you're moving on, and you're still alive. You are still alive. You haven't died yet. Alright, that is going to do it for my recap, my overview analysis of the first round games in the LCK Regional Qualifier here. Obviously, we've got another game to preview here. It is Liiv SANDBOX taking on DRX, the winner getting the 4th spot at Worlds for the LCK. They're going to have to go through play-ins, but they do keep their Worlds dreams alive here. Now, if only there was someone who predicted both upsets here in the regional qualifier. I don't know anybody like that, though. Oh, man. I'm trying to joke around with this a little bit. I hope you guys don't take anything I say on here too seriously. It's going to be a fun matchup here between Liiv and DRX, and I'm excited to preview it. Obviously, we already talked about this a bit in my LCK playoff primer video in terms of, like, lane versus lane matchups. If you want to see that analysis, you can go check out that video in the iCard right now. But let's go ahead and talk about where I think both of these teams are standing right now. Well, Liiv coming off of a pretty crushing defeat to DAMWON. They just did not look like they were on remotely the same level as a team like DAMWON. I still value Liiv SANDBOX, but they started to go away from some of the stuff that made them successful in the regular season. The reason that they were the 3 seed in this regional qualifier and not, you know, like a 4, 5, or 6 seed is the fact that they were playing through one of the big outstanding players of the season in Prince in the bottom lane. And Kale had a great season, and Krako did a great job enabling him. Closer and Dove were more supplementary pieces towards that team, but in the first round, they really wanted to play towards Closer in that mid lane significantly more, and I just don't think that's the strategy that I personally would go to. I think Prince has shown that if you put resources into him, even in high-pressure scenarios, he's able to win games, and hell, he showed that against DRX specifically as well. So overall, I would expect Liiv to go back to that, but if they don't, I could see them being in a little bit of trouble. As for DRX, big win over KT. You bring Juhan into the jungle. I don't know if that will last, if it will be Juhan or if it will be Pyosik. I think Juhan gives you more consistency. I think Pyosik is the better player at his best. I think really you're just going to have to make the decision on the day. Whatever you go with, I think is going to be the right decision. You obviously have the opportunity to switch things around in the series. This is one of the few cases in terms of substitutions that I'm really not sure which one is better. So for DRX, I'm going to trust whichever decision that they make, they feel is the right one. But they really are starting to peak at the right time. Like I said in the series against KT, when this team is at their best, they honestly are better than Liiv SANDBOX, and they should be in a position to be able to beat Liiv SANDBOX, but this team has certainly not been at its best all year. Pyosik, player like Beryl, have really been underperforming throughout the majority of this split. If they can turn it around and have a series like they did against KT, maybe we can get a more consistent play out of Zika, especially if we get a full series out of Juhan. I think DRX could actually be a big spoiler here in the 4th seeded game, but either way, I think the series is going to be a lot of fun. I predicted Liiv SANDBOX to win this. I did say in 4 or 5 games, and I'm going to stick to that, but if DRX won, I certainly would not be surprised. I think the series is very even. I will technically change my prediction from Liiv in 4 or 5 to Liiv in 5 or DRX in 5. I usually like to give that 2, range, that 2-game range. And I think the range, instead of being Liiv in 4 or 5, is Liiv in 5 or DRX in 5. I think they are basically evenly matched. I would give the slight edge to Liiv SANDBOX because, again, they've been able to get the better of DRX all year long. But if they don't start to play towards their game again, which is Prince, I can definitely see a world in which DRX is just more consistent in the mid lane matchup. So very, very excited to watch that, but we're going to have to wait a little bit for that. With all that being said, I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, please go ahead and leave a like. It really lets me know you're enjoying the content. Let me know in the comment section what you guys think of the Liiv SANDBOX DRX matchup. Obviously, it's incredibly interesting, and I think there are many outcomes that both of these teams could go through. So let me know which one you're expecting to see down in the comment section below. You know I love chatting it up with you guys. You know I love hearing your opinions and going through everything. So with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.